Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they?
32. Lucose looks in a mirror. I got to the steps of Odeberg's house like a swimmer reaching the far shore. Behind me, the moonlight raged, but above me, silent and dark, were the stairs that led upwards to the communal door. I stopped a long while on the top step, just in front of the door. I told myself it was to get my breath back from my run, but it also served as a space to gather my courage. I lit a cigarette. The flame from the lighter shook, and it took me some time to get the cigarette alight. Then I breathed in the smoke and filled my lungs with it. Finally, I pushed at the door. It was open. I'd expected it to be somehow. I stood outside as the door slowly swung into the room, revealing absolute darkness. The white light of the moon inveigled its way through the door and colonized the hallway. I wished I'd brought a flashlight, but all I had was my petrol cigarette lighter. Feeling like the little Dutch boy and his little thumb, I waded into the flood of dark. With my lighter held high, I was a source of light that would surely drag eyes to me like moths to a flame, if there were any eyes looking. I felt conspicuous, and if there had been any usable glimmer in there, I would have extinguished the lighter. As it was, I was forced to be a beacon. I turned the flame to its highest extent so it spouted like a torch, yellow and blue, and guttered in the crossing drafts from invisible corners. Up 2 stairs and listen. I listened so hard I thought I heard the ocean in my ears. I saw an electric light switch on the first landing by the doors to the other flats. I flicked it, but nothing happened. Then I listened for the sounds of life from the other apartments, but there was nothing, just a distant hiss of the sea. Of course, there was no one about, and the lights didn't work. The very stuff of nightmares. I spat out the cigarette and ground it out with my boot. It was making my head spin. More steps. I got up to Odeberg's front door and let my aching thumb rest. The lighter clicked off, and darkness drowned me. I put my fingers silently against the warm wood of his door, just to prove the world was still there. Not a sound from inside. He might have already gone. I pushed the door gently, and I felt it open. It had been unlocked like the front door. The thought crossed my mind that someone might be waiting for me. My heart beat faster, my mouth went dry, the hairs raised up on the back of my neck. I got the feeling you get when they say someone has just walked over your grave. I had to go in, not point hovering around on the threshold like a nervous suitor, but I waited a little longer. Maybe I should just step in and shout his name. So I stepped into the apartment and then waited, my heart beating. The darkness whirled and sucked around me. The spinning noises it made were just in my head, but they were real enough for all that. This was stupid. I couldn't see a thing. Odeberg wasn't here. Why not just turn round and go home? Then I laughed at myself. I had no home. And out was into that awful moonlight, with its crabs and whispers crisscrossing. Automatically, I put my fingers to my eye patch and the hollow socket beneath. Somehow, it gave me courage. I lit the lighter again. I'd been to Odeberg's flat only once, but in the odorous hissing of the lighter flame, it looked very different. Perspectives changed, and I started as I saw faces made out of patterns in the wainscot. Perhaps I should blame my imagination rather than the lighter for those. I took out my gun and whispered, "Wilhelm." There was no way he could have heard that whisper, even if he'd been in the parlour just through the door. I cleared my throat and I said, "Wilhelm." Then I thought that they knew where I was anyway, so I shouted, "Wilhelm!" My voice stopped as soon as I'd said it. No echo. Completely absorbed into the wood and fabric of the furniture and walls. I listened hard and heard nothing, not a footstep, not a creak, and so I walked briskly through into the parlour and then into all the other rooms. Finally, out of some sense of propriety, I guess, or maybe fear, I went into Rosa's room. I jumped back and just stopped myself aiming my gun at the bed. There was a shape in there. It was someone, but it hadn't moved. I waited a long while, covering it with my gun, ready to shoot it if it started to get up, but it remained motionless. I walked forward, and keeping a gun in one hand and the lighter in the other, I prodded the blanket-draped shape with my foot. It felt ominously heavy and still. Holstering the gun, I stepped forward and pulled back the sheet. It was Rosa, and she was dead. I couldn't imagine the ambulance men would have just dumped her like this. But time, space, and morality were warped in that place. There she was, eine schöne Leiche, a beautiful corpse. Things moved towards their end, and I thought that Rosa's death, all deaths, were just part of a plot conceived by some bleak, compassionless playwright. What could I do? I left her there and went out. I began to wonder if Wilhelm had seen her, and whether I would find him similarly cold and reduced to an ugly bulk on the floor in some room I hadn't searched thoroughly enough. So I went through all the rooms again. At least I found a candle in the kitchen so I could relieve my thumb. I was about to leave the house. I had wandered with my candle enough through the apartment and its rooms once, twice, even 4 times, looking in every single nook and cranny, and I had failed to find Wilhelm Oderberg. Then, on my way back to the front door, candle held aloft, some movement caught my eye. I put the candle down on a wooden chest and quickly pulled out my pistol. I span round. What had I seen? I scanned the area. There wasn't even a door that someone could have darted into. Then I saw the mirror. It was hung on the wall, fairly ordinary, with the ornate gilt frame so beloved of the aspiring Viennese. There was something moving in it, and it wasn't a reflection because the mirror only looked across the corridor to a blank wall. Les miroirs sont les portes par lesquelles la mort vient et va. I'd switched to dream mode, and I accepted everything bizarre and unworldly given to me by the dream, a world in a mirror. I picked up the candle and went to peer into the silvered glass. I jolted back as if I'd been electrocuted. I'd expected to see some kind of murky depths with shapes forming cloudily in them, like some kind of crystal ball. But I saw a reflection as clear and crisp as any normal reflection, except it wasn't of me. It was of Oderberg. He was trapped in some other version of this house, a version even more uncanny than the one I was in. He stood there looking out at me. His face was drawn, and there was a gash in his throat. Blood ran down his neck onto his shirt, and he didn't wipe it away. He saw me, and he started to say something. He said it with an urgency, almost as if he were shouting, but I could hardly hear it. I put my ear to the mirror. It was cold. I could hear him shouting, but it was as if he was shouting into a gale. He kept repeating a phrase over and over again. Then finally I deciphered it. He said, "Give me the book." Silently I mouthed, "Which book?" He pointed, and I saw an old book lying on the floor as if he had dropped it. It was a yellowing hardback volume with creases and stains on it. I picked it up. It was volume 2 of the history of the Austro-Hungarian railway system. I almost laughed, but he nodded vigorously, as if to him the book was the most sacred scripture. Took it out and wondered how I was going to get it to him. He kept shouting, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. He looked as if he was getting desperate, so, at a loss as what to do, I held it up to the mirror, pages held open at the middle so that he could read it. He looked at it, and an expression of enormous relief came over his face. Baffled, I watched him as his face diminished into the mirror and was gone. And then I heard footsteps. I listened hard, trying to know whether the sound was a creak or the tread of someone coming up the stairs. If there was someone there, they were being very careful not to make too much noise. That meant that they guessed that I or someone else, most probably Oderberg, was in the apartment. Not just friends come to call then. Either that or my imagination was running away with me. I took my gun out and cocked it just to be on the safe side. Fact or figment, it was going to get plugged. Cocking an automatic pistol makes it sound much like a cash register and is equally as pleasant. It let them know I was there, but they seemed to know that anyway. A creak on the staircase. Definitely someone coming up. I walked quickly but quietly through to the living room and squatted down behind the cracked leather sofa. I was in a pool of darkness outside the reach of the greedy moonlight that came in through the window. From where I was, I could see the door and anyone who had come in through it, but they couldn't see me. I waited, and then the door silently began to open. I stopped breathing and held the pistol in 2 hands before me, just resting on the top of the settee. Don't breathe, take a steady aim, and squeeze, don't pull. The words my army firearms instructor came back down the years. As quiet as a mouse, Morello stepped into the room. I didn't want to rush at it. Another step and I'd get a good headshot. The decision was already made, but then behind him came Tasmin. My view of the world suddenly seemed rather faulty and things started to seesaw around in my head. She was being as quiet as he was. She was on his side. Maybe. She'd always been on his side. An icy river poured into my stomach. I lost my aim, but she couldn't be on his side. My head spun, trying to think of how much I'd been taken in. What had I revealed that made me vulnerable? That she couldn't be with them. I stood up and said, "Tasmin, what are you doing with him?" It wasn't a wise thing to do, but I did it. Morello turned so his face was lit by the moon. He smiled one of his smug, self-satisfied grins, and I lifted my pistol and fired at him. My aim was off. The shot reported in my ears. I told myself 1,000 times not to shoot indoors. It makes you deaf. Even now, I imagined blood trickling out of my ear. I stood up in a daze from the noise and was smashed back against the wall. He crossed the ground between us very fast. My head cracked off the plaster and I stumbled forward. He hit me very hard in the face and I fired again. I didn't know what I was aiming at, but I was very angry and I fired again with the hope that I might kill him. He was very strong and very quick. What the hell was she doing with him? As I lay there, all the fuzz went out of my damaged head at the prick of a cold blade to my throat. It appeared I still didn't want to die. "Tasmin, what's going on?" With his free hand, he punched me in the face. "Shut up," he snarled. Then he turned to Tasmin. "Well?" I couldn't see anything really, because blood was running into my eyes from a cut eyebrow and she was standing out of the light. She seemed to be replying in the negative. Morello got impatient. "He has betrayed you with her, with lots of women. You saw that. Let him hear you tell me to kill him." This time, she quite clearly said, "No." I tried to work out what was going on. "You saw him." "I don't know what I saw." Daring another fist in the face, I said, "What are you supposed to have seen?" He struck me again, this time in the mouth. I saw red and lunged at him, but he interposed the knife and I stopped at its point. "Any time, Lycos. Be my guest." Tasmin was crying. "I saw you with her. I knew you didn't love me, but I thought at least you'd be faithful to Louise." She must mean Liesel. I tried to think of exactly what she had seen. I had been with Liesel, but she couldn't have seen that. They must have set me up with her outside just before I came here. She thought she saw something, but nothing had happened. I didn't want her. He struck me again, but this time not so hard. Maybe he was getting bored of hitting me. Maybe his hand hurt. Tasmin shouted at him, "Leave him alone, stop hitting him." He didn't hit me again, not that time. I wiped the blood out of my eye. He let me up, and when I looked at him again, he was unsure of himself, just a little, but it must have been a novel experience for him. I guessed he thought he had Tasmin under his spell. He didn't know her as well as I did. But he was so arrogant that he thought he could make anybody do anything. That was his weakness. I said, "Tasmin, you've got to believe me. They set me up." In a low voice, she said, "I don't know, Christian." Suddenly, Morello sprang forward. I fell back against the wall, trying to dodge an imagined lunge with the knife. But he didn't try to do that. He ran forward across the room, past Tasmin, and he was gone. Why didn't he kill me? She shrugged. He wanted the pleasure of me telling him to. "He's so twisted. Why is it so important that you tell him to kill me?" "Because I'm the one that loves you." And so she finally said it. I actually blushed, though she couldn't see it. I ran my hand through my hair. There was blood in it. I started to speak, but couldn't finish the sentence. What was I supposed to say? She came over to me and took my hand. She stood inches in front of me. I felt her warmth. I smelled the scent of her hair. In the dark, I felt her eyes looking into me. I felt I should reply. She said, I don't care what you think about me. We might die tonight, we might die any night, and I couldn't die without letting you know. But of course I'd always known. She waited, and still I didn't say anything. She must have thought that meant I was rejecting her, because she looked down and started to walk away. I grabbed her wrist and pulled her back to me. She wanted me to tell her I loved her too. I cared very much for her, but I couldn't lie. I said, Tasmin, I'd be dead if not for you. I'm stupid and pathetic, and you really have no idea how vile I am under all this talk and posturing. I know what you are. I couldn't meet her eye. A good man, she said. Do you care anything at all for me? I put my hands up. Of course, a lot. You're my friend, maybe my best friend. She nodded silently. We need to find Wilhelm. He's not in this house. He's in another house like it, but he's not in this house. Chapter 33. Gottfried Engelmann enters the mirror. I followed the professor to his house and waited for it to get dark. You see, I thought that he might know how to untangle the roots that were growing round my head. He seemed a wise old bird, an owl, big wise eyes, always buried in a book. I even thought he might be the wise old man in fairy tales. So I waited, and it got dark. It never takes long to get dark. Into the house I tiptoed up the stone steps, pushing open the big door. It was unlocked. That made me nervous. They knew I'd be coming and had made provisions. The prof's apartment was up some more steps. I knew where it was because I'd scouted it out. I'd once come in the guise of an onion seller, but the horrid maid had seen through me and thrown me out for a fraud. She invited little Liesel in, and Morello, but not me. I didn't get in, but still, I'd seen the lay of the land. These wooden stairs creaked, and it was very dark, very dark. I didn't want to look at the moon because she gives me nightmares. She's always waiting for me to turn round so that she can talk to me and tell me how loose the nut that holds the world together really is. I didn't want to listen to her. Creak, creak, black, black. I took too long on the stairs, too long for my own comfort, but it didn't bother the professor because he was reading upstairs. Upstairs, I heard him muttering to himself as he read. Even children don't have to read aloud anymore. What's he playing at? Unless it's magic. Maybe he thinks that those words can make things be. Maybe they can. He's the wise man after all. I got up into the apartment, and just as I turned the door handle to silently close it behind me, I heard feet. There was a cupboard, and I went in. It smelled of old winter coats that hadn't been allowed to dry, and shoes and shoe polish. The rough coats pushed into my face because I didn't dare look at the door. There was even one with fur, a woman's coat. She wouldn't be needing that anymore. I'd seen her through the window, and she looked very sick then. How much worse must she be now? Much worse. Or better, maybe, once it was all over. Mustn't let my mind wander. My failing, I'm afraid, but it keeps coming back to him inside. Yes, let's wander, so we don't have to look. Feet outside, light feet, shuffle, shuffle, and then stop outside the door. Stop breathing, Gottfried. They're not man's feet, but a lady's. I don't like her sharp teeth and bright eyes, that lady, because that's who it is. Stop breathing. And she walked on. But I had the feeling she knew I was there. Out into the corridor, a wicked thrill in my stomach from creeping unnoticed round the house. 1 minute the professor was there, muttering over his books. Then he was gone. He must be with the lady. He won't like that. Not in the end, though she has a winning smile at first. At first, I tiptoed. Then I grew bold. I wandered that unimaginably huge house. Endless corridors in the dark. just the light from the mirrors to guide me. Room after room, corridor after corridor. It could be that I'm going round in circles, I thought. Then, halfway between today and tomorrow, not really, just my little joke, because today and tomorrow are just your silly ideas. It's always now, not halfway between anywhere. As I said, down the corridor, a cold wind blew in my face. I knew something was coming, and I felt it was coming from winter. Then the smell of an animal, a nice animal, but in this context frightening because I guessed what it might mean. You always know you're at the end, though you might kid yourself. It appeared from the wind, a white horse. I don't know how it properly fitted in that corridor. It stood there sad and big-eyed, big brown-eyed. I think it was sorry for me, a bit guilty. But I didn't blame it, because it had its job to do, leading away souls. I felt like I was being called to the dentist's. I felt sorry. Tears rolled down my cheeks. I wanted to hug the horse and tell him it wasn't his fault. He looked so sad. Sorry for myself, too. I sat on the floor. Thump. The horse vanished just as well, but the quiet was worse. The night waited for me. It had come at last. But then a long pause as I sat there. I picked my nose absent-mindedly, and that was my first clue that the crisis was over. Not at that acute moment, obviously. I thanked my wandering mind for giving me such help. But I'd seen the horse. Never mind, because I could be wrong about that old horse. So I got up and explored some more. I turned the handle of the door into the bedroom, and once I'd opened it, I stood there in amazement. In front of me was an apparition. I don't think it was real, because, for one thing, I'm mad, and mad people see things, and, for another, it was very dark. How could I see anything in that gloom? Even so, it was very interesting, though it meant nothing to me. Perhaps it will mean more to you. Here's what I saw. The professor upside down in the air in front of me. Through the mirror, I could see his library was on the shelves all around, and he hung there, his legs slightly bent, his hand out, fingers splayed, as if groping for a lost ring. His hair thinned out, as if he were underwater. It was as if he was drowned. His face was pale, but his eyes were pearls. The room was full of water, though I breathed air. Consider Phlebas, who was once young and tall as you. I stood there watching him as he moved in the deep sea swell. It was mesmerizing, the undulating rhythm and the lost call of gulls. Full of nostalgia, I thought of Tyre in my youth, but then I remembered I'd made my youth up. I'd been born fully formed in the Stare Mesto. City, city, where ghosts accost men in full daylight. Moonlight's more acceptable. This house was my city, my labyrinthine home, because that's what city means. Lost in dreams as I was, I started to hum an appropriate tune to the rise and fall of the imaginary corpse. Not Mahler again, he said. I turned round to see the Philistine face of the Italian assassin. The professor was so shocked by this man's rapid entrance without invitation that he promptly vanished, and then I knew the horse had been right. Some men have no mercy. Generally those without the imagination to put themselves in someone else's shoes. Morello was only himself, locked in his own mind, it not even occurring to him that anyone else really existed. We were all just meat to project his maelstrom onto. That's why he could be so cruel. He knew we could hurt, but he didn't think he was one of us, so it didn't matter. I punched him, but it didn't stop him. I could hardly see without the professor's nacreous glow from the mirror, and I stumbled. I think that saved me, because he fell over my body. I got up and was at the door, but not before a burning, wet, and hope it goes away soon kind of sting in my side. I shouted something rude and ran. Through the rooms and their connecting doors I ran, and he came after me, laughing because of my drip, drip, drip of blood that would lead him. I thought I could run round in circles and make his head spin, but my shirt was wet and sticky, and I knew I'd run out of blood before he gave up. Breathing became difficult. Then I saw a face in the mirror that wasn't mine. I wasn't surprised, of course, after the horse and then the professor, but I was curious to see whether it had a message for me, this being my time of need. A bit of divine reassurance just now at the end would be perfectly fitting in a fictional tale, and what we all hope for in reality, too. I saw the concerned faces of Monsieur Le Cause and his lovely never-wife-to-be, the Miss Tasman. How perfectly suited they were. Romeo and Juliet, or Tristan and Iseult. They saw me too. Now, I thought they were real. It's very rare that you're completely confused about these things, even when you're round the bend. I looked around me, Morello and his wicked dagger forgotten for a while, as I surrendered to curiosity. No, they weren't in the corridor with me, even though they were in the mirror. I looked back at them and smiled. I held up my hand, which I'd smeared with blood. I suppose I was looking for sympathy, but please don't be too hard on me for that. This was the end of my life, after all. They shouted, but their voices were very tinny. Then, stage right, entered Morello. He was grinning, and I really worried that he wasn't quite right in the head. As he strode toward me at demonic speed, I saw that instead of his dagger, he was holding a large hammer. From his pocket, he produced a handful of long iron nails. From his smile and the fact he'd already stabbed me quite seriously, I guessed that he meant me no good. Feeling rather like Alice, I got hold of the frame and pushed myself into the glass. None too soon either, because Morello was right behind me. 34. Tasman in the House of Nightmares. It was all very difficult. Christian looked at me for a long time without saying anything. Then he bent down and picked up a piece of candle. With his cigarette lighter, he lit the wick and placed it on a French-polished table. Then he sat down on the chair. I looked away from him over my shoulder, fooling myself into thinking it was in case Morello came back, when I knew it was really because I couldn't look him in the eye. I said, "Have you looked around the house?" He nodded. "Of course." "Any sign of Wilhelm?" "Yes, I saw him. He's in the mirror." He got up without saying anything and walked over to the mirror on the wall. He stared into that mirror, as if he were looking at a vision of angels, when instead I knew all it could be was his own face. Then my eye was caught by some movement in there. I looked past him and he saw me looking. That's where Audible is, in some other version of this house, through the looking glass. And I don't know how to get him out. I knew he wasn't joking. I said, "You're serious, aren't you?" But I knew he couldn't be, unless our lives were nightmares. I felt disorientated. My head was spinning, but I was drawn to look into the mirror. I took a step forward. There was something moving in there, something that wasn't a reflection. I peered into the silvered glass. There was somebody in there, but it was dark and I couldn't make out who it was. It didn't look like Wilhelm. Falteringly, I said, "Is it a window rather than a mirror?" "I don't know. What's moving in it? Something's struggling deep inside, like it's trying to get free." Then the mirror burst outwards and something came through it into the room. It was a man, and he stumbled through, sprawling in a shower of glass. I put my hand up to cover my eyes from the splinters and fell backwards. In the light of the flickering candle, I saw that the mirror was completely smashed. Slivers of silvered glass lay all over the carpet and furniture, glittering in the shifting candlelight. The contours of the wrecked frame were picked out in gold and black as the shadows washed over the gilt. I looked in vain at the wall, frantically again and again, trying to confirm that there had been a door or a window behind the mirror. But the wall was blank and unpierced. It had just been a mirror, and through it had come our visitor. Christian had him in a headlock. It was Gottfried Engelmann. A piece of glass had cut the back of my hand, and a drop of blood had run down it towards my middle finger in a dainty wet trail. Engelmann glanced at it and shook his head. "It won't buy you salvation, you know, the blood." Christian let him go and sat back. Engelmann rubbed his neck. I noticed that he was bleeding heavily from a wound in his side. His clothes were heavy and dark with blood. He was clearly in pain, but he grinned and pointed at the broken mirror. "He won't be coming through there in a hurry." I got up. "Mr. Engelmann, could you tell me what's going on?" Well, gracious lady, I'm afraid not. I don't really know myself, but I think it's bad. How did you get into the mirror? Asked Christian, like it was an everyday sort of question. Engelman shook his head as if we were idiots. No, it's you who were in the mirror, and me now. I wasn't before. I was in the professor's house. I went forward and grabbed his arm. Where is the professor? He winced a little. I don't know. I followed him into his house, and then I lost him. It's very large in there, you know. Lots of dark corridors and grinning ladies. It's almost a city with those dark winding streets and shady characters. I said, just talk slowly so I can understand what you're saying. Christian shook his head. You won't get any sense out of him. He's mad. I said, sanity only works in a sane world. We've crossed some kind of boundary. Perhaps madness will be a surer guide than reason. We're not in Kansas anymore. What? It's from a play I once saw. I didn't understand what he was talking about, so I turned back to Engelman. Gottfried, can you help us find the professor? He shook his head. He was weakening from his wound, which was still bleeding. I took his jacket off as carefully as I could. He was on the verge of fainting, but he managed to hang on through the pain. I used his shirt to mop up the blood so that I could see the wound. It was small and neat. It was hardly believable that it would cause so much bleeding. Just then, there was an awful knocking at what must have been the front door. It boomed 3 times, as if someone was seeking entrance to the gates of hell. Christian sprang up. A spasm of fear flashed over Engelman's face. Engelman said, as if it wasn't obvious, "They're announcing that they've arrived." Then he started babbling. "Don't let him get me. I say my prayers. It's not fair that he should come for me. What about all the naughty boys who steal apples? I never stole apples." I tore the shirt and tied the makeshift bandage round his waist to try and staunch the bleeding. He needed urgent medical attention, and he probably wasn't going to get it. I heard a loud bang, and then the front door judder open as if someone had given it an almighty kick. Christian looked at me. "Let's get out of here." But we can't leave him." I gestured to Engelman, who'd curled up like a baby and was shaking on the floor, eyes tight closed, mouth muttering silent prayers. I meant all of us. Christian bent down and pulled Engelman to his feet. He said, "I can't carry you. You'll have to help me." Engelman threaded his arm around Christian's shoulder. I heard footsteps coming through the flat towards us. "Hurry, hurry!" We went through the door, leaving the mirror room and the candle behind us. We entered another small anteroom. I didn't remember it being part of Wilhelm and Rose's apartment, but I wasn't sure where we were. This was a kind of plastic fantasy that extruded itself before us. Down the dark corridors we went, leaving a damp trail of blood behind us on the wooden parquet floor and the oriental rugs. Whoever was coming could not fail to find us. It was dark, but as we processed through the rooms, Christian breathing heavily but unwilling to stop or put Engelman down, the moon seeped in through odd windows and lit our way like a baleful lantern. I've always been frightened of the moon. I remember as a girl waking up to find the moonlight full in my face. It had given me nightmares. But here the moonlight was not hostile. Her craggy, pockmarked, silent face as she hung up there in the wild sky was utterly disinterested. I think I was drifting into some kind of waking sleep state. Then Christian suddenly stopped and put Engelman gently down on the floor. He's dead. The footsteps were coming after us still. Unhurried and almost leisurely, they had followed us through all the twists and turns. I looked at him. Whoever it is still coming. Why don't we stand and fight? No, not here. We're at its mercy. This weird labyrinth is its home, not ours. He bent down again and pulled Engelman up. I said, "What are you doing? He's dead." "Yes, but I can't leave him here for that thing." He pulled him up and hurriedly we opened the door in front of us. It led us back to the mirror room. The mirror still lay smashed on the floor. The candle still burned. The wax appeared not to have burnt down at all. I ran ahead and tried the far door. I rattled the handle, but it was locked. I shook my head. No. Whatever it was at the door behind us. Christian dropped Engelman and turned prepared to fight, but I pulled his arm and rushed towards the cupboard. He tried to protest, no doubt hiding in a cupboard, offending his sense of honor, but I opened the door and pushed him in. It was small in there and completely dark. I was pressed against Christian. I could hardly breathe. I listened with all my power. There were the sounds of dragging furniture. I don't know what I'd expected, but not this. Then a pause. Then unidentifiable small sounds. Then the clear noise of someone smashing furniture with some kind of implement, probably a hammer. In a way, such workman-like sounds were more terrifying than what I'd expected to hear, the sound of monstrous breathing or of feeding. I was squeezed right up against Christian. I could feel his pulse and the warmth of his breath on my temple. I don't know why I did it. Because I thought I was going to die, I suppose. But I reached up and kissed him. But the kiss was broken by the sound of a voice. I couldn't hear what he said, but it was Engelman's voice. He wasn't dead after all. A wave of dismay and betrayal sank through my innards. Then there was another voice. It was Morello. I clearly heard him say, "To be resurrected, you must first be crucified." There was a sound of a hammer falling. Christian burst past me out of the cupboard. I followed. Morello spun round. He was holding a hammer in one hand, and in his teeth he bit onto 4 or 5 long iron nails, just like a carpenter. He'd made a makeshift cross out of bits of wood from the chaise longue and the door frame, and had bound Engelman to it. He was just about to drive a nail through Engelman's right hand. Morello looked taken aback. He must have known we were in the house, but he obviously hadn't thought we were so close. Maybe he thought someone else had killed us already, or that someone was letting us run on through the corridors, knowing he'd catch up with us when it suited him. He raised the hammer and swung it at Christian. Christian rushed forward, and as he moved, stooped down and picked up a large shard of mirror. With one smooth movement, he stood up and thrust it up under Morello's diaphragm. The hammer blow came down, but the strength had already gone from Morello's arm. Morello fell back, blood blossoming through his lips like a shiny red flower. He made gurgling noises and fell backwards across the floor. At one point he tried to say something. Then his beautiful dark eyes closed forever. Blood ran from his mouth down his cheek to pool in his ear and mat the curly black locks of hair. Christian had cut his hand on the glass. Not badly, but it too was bleeding. I tried to see to his wound, but he went over and fumbled at the knots of shredded upholstery that held Engelman to the cross. Engelman was in a bad way. I heard Christian say, "I'm sorry I left you. I thought you were dead." Engelman smiled, baring his teeth, his lips tight with fear. "Mea culpa, mea culpa, mea culpa. I am guilty. I did murder Christ, but you would have done the same in my position." Then he slumped, and the blood bubbled in his throat. This time, he was truly dead. 35. Lecoz and Tasmin in a world turned backwards. I remember the war, with men and animals drowning in seas of mud, the skies filled with whizzing, falling metal, bits of men, corpses you had to look at hard to work out which way round they were. And now time has stopped, and there is another world through the mirror. The mind normalizes it, and we go on. At least I think we go on. I didn't want to look too hard in case I found I was coming apart. Tasmin certainly looked like she was, eyes wide, back of hand to her mouth, trembling at everything. I put my hand on her shoulder. Engelman really was dead. There was a world through the mirror. Outside, the moon rode through the clouds. The light was getting inside my eyes and rolling around my head. "Just don't think," I said to her. "Just don't think," and pulled her away from Engelman. She didn't want to come with me. She stood there staring at him like it was her fault. "Come on," I said, and I tugged her away through the room. Outside the mirror room, I stopped and lit a cigarette, with the lighter in my right hand, and the left one had part of Engelman's shirt wrapped round it as a bandage. Both hands were shaking badly. We were in the living room. The thought struck me that there was probably a drink in that room, and so, cigarette in hand, I searched the room and found, inside a kind of dresser of some description, a decanter. It was brandy and tasted like it had been there a long time, if you can taste that from brandy. It was certainly unpleasant. The blood from my cut hand smeared all over the crystal. Tasmin sat down in a leather chair by the window. She said, "Christian, what's happening?" I shrugged and had another slug at the lead crystal neck of the decanter. Moonlight again. "Pull the drapes, will you?" I took the decanter and went over to her. "Here, drink this." I could see blood on her dress from my cut, so I pulled my hands away. She said, "How are we going to find Wilhelm?" I looked away, not at anything, just away, because I hadn't wanted to hear that question. Not because I didn't want to find him, but because I didn't know how to. I remained silent, but took another drink of brandy. She said, "For God's sake, Christian, this is not the time to get drunk." "I'm not getting drunk, I'm just having a drink." She said, "Light me a cigarette, then, please." She'd been brought up to be polite, but her nerves were getting the better of her. I pulled out a cigarette from the packet, I lit it, and she dragged the smoke into her lungs. She breathed it in like it was pure oxygen. Then she suddenly stood up. "There's a mirror in the kitchen, I remember." Then she hurried through the door into the kitchen. I followed her. There was a small window, but it faced into the central courtyard rather than the street, and it was dark. I found another candle and lit it. There was a small mirror above the sink. Our faces huddled behind the warm yellow flame in it, reflected there in that homely object. It was marked with splashes of water from a previous session of washing dishes. I'd been told that the maid hadn't been much good, and here was the evidence of her slovenliness. There was no sign of Odeberg in the mirror. Tasmin reached out, about to tap the glass with her long artistic fingers. I grabbed her hand before she touched it. What are you doing?" She shrugged and took another drag of a cigarette. "I just wanted to see if I could put my hand through it." She pulled her hand from my grasp. This time I didn't stop her. Her fingers tapped on the glass. It was as impermeable as normal. She exhaled forcibly. "What are we going to do?" I put the candle on the metal draining board. I said, "Wait. They probably have something in store for us yet." There were metal and ceramic surfaces all around that kitchen, the stove, the mirror, a spoon on the draining board, the glass of the window. The candle flame danced, distorted but faithful in all of them. We were encircled by images of fire, mellowed, blurred and warm, all around. It occurred to me that I might die by morning, maybe in the next hour or next 10 minutes. But that was a comfortable feeling in a strange way. Comfortable because I'd lived with it before, ever since Verdun. But now I'd finally come to terms with the contingency of life. Life and death were beyond my power, at least my own were. I'd have to surrender to the bigger picture of life, even though I was unsure whether life cared, whether I lived or died. And then there was something more than the candle dancing all around us. In all the reflections there was something else. The hair prickled on the back of my neck. The skin of my arms rose in goose flesh. Tasmin looked up. "Christian, what's wrong?" I felt it coming, even though Tasmin couldn't. A numinous awe inflated inside of me. She was coming. I looked around me in terror. This time she was coming for me. In all the surfaces, but clearer in the mirror, I saw her face, white-skinned, red-mouthed, her eyes violet and her hair coal black. She had a look on her face that wasn't a smile. It was the face of a woman confident and filled with lust. She pressed at the glass and on the inside of the metal surfaces. Soon she would come through the skin of the bubble that kept our world. I stood away from Tasmin. Liesl was near. I felt fear in my throat, rising together to greet her. If she came, I couldn't resist her, and there was nowhere for me to run. I could see her in the mirror. On her head she wore the twin-horned crown of Isis, the crown of the crescent moon. Her fingers were long and cruel, draped in black. She was giver of life and destroyer, maiden, mother, and crone. No man can resist her. Not me. Certainly not me. I backed into a corner, and she burst into our world. Tasmin looked at me and then back at Liesl. Liesl advanced towards me, slow and certain, the inexorable seductress. I stood with my back to the wall. Tasmin saw that I would give myself up to her. Liesl wouldn't take my life. I would give it to her. I wanted to look at Tasmin, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the celestial beauty of the vampire. She came close. She brought her hands up to the sides of my face and caressed me. Her fingers were cold, her nails sharp. She opened her mouth languorously, her lips scarlet, her mouth the tooth-filled maw of a fish. And then Tasmin touched her arm. Liesl looked round, surprised, as if she'd forgotten Tasmin was there. She looked bemused. But Tasmin moved her face towards Liesl. I thought she was going to kiss her. She brought her mouth close and opened her lips, but instead of kissing Liesl, she breathed in. Liesl fluttered like a cinema image projected onto cloth. She began to change shape, and like a form composed of coloured smoke, she was inhaled. Her figure was drawn up into Tasmin's mouth and down into her throat. Tasmin breathed in only for a normal time, but when she stopped, Liesl had disappeared inside her. I was struck dumb by what I'd seen. When Tasmin came towards me, I backed away because I was fearful that in some way she would have become Liesl. When she saw I was frightened, she said, "Don't be silly, it's only me." I said, "What happened? How did you do that?" She shook her head. She was smiling. She said, "Liesl was only a symbol of our lust. She came from our minds and our breath, so I breathed her in." I remember being told before that they were only symbols, but I never truly understood how a living symbol awakens and reawakens. They do not live, they do not die, and killing them is impossible. Then I watched as her face fought to stop the smile becoming a sob. I put my hand out to her and she grabbed it tight. She didn't want to cry, and I didn't know what to think. Then she said, "I remember now, there's a big mirror in the library." She ran out of the kitchen, pulling me after her. We got to the library door. It was locked. Her voice was filled with a mix of hope and dread. Open it, open it. He might be in there." I tried the handle. It was definitely locked. I kicked it and made little impression. Tasmin said, "Do you smell that? What is it? It smells like flowers, jasmine or something." I couldn't smell flowers, but there was something, like something was burning. I kicked the door again and again, putting my full weight into it. It moved, and then with another boot, it flew open. I expected to see a darkened room full of bookshelves with a mirror on the far wall, but there wasn't anything like that. Standing there, radiant, gleaming, alive, with wings and white opals for its eyes, was an angel. In its hands it held a sword, and this sword turned every way. It blocked the door to the library, and there was no way we could get round it. It looked like Liesl. "Where's Wilhelm?" Tasmin shouted at it, but it didn't show any sign of having heard her. The sword whirled round. She shouted again, "Where's Wilhelm?" But its white opal eyes did not even flicker. I put my hand on her shoulder. "It's not going to let us through." She turned to me, and this time there were tears coursing down her cheeks. "What about Wilhelm? I know he's through there. I just know it." I held her arm. "It won't let us through. There must be another way we can try." I said that, but I knew that Wilhelm was on his own. We're all on our own. Though sometimes we can find companionship on the journey. I led her away, and like Adam and Eve cast out of the Garden of Eden, we went out of the apartment, down the stairs, and onto the street. 36. Wilhelm Oderberg finally chooses. When I recovered consciousness, I was alone in the house. My daughter Liesl was gone, and so was the pomegranate she'd offered me. As I drifted, not quite aware of the floors, walls, furniture, the carpets upon which we had walked, I felt a ragged pain at my throat. I reached up to it and found the rough edges of an angry wound. The tips of my fingers were wet. I didn't need the light to know that it was blood. I groaned and lay back on the wooden floor. I was still alive and could not rest yet. As I lay there, I wondered why I had been allowed to live, and it came to me that it was to prolong the agony of living. Everything had been taken from me. Everything except the quest for knowledge, and in truth, that was all I'd ever really nurtured. They would leave me here now in knowledge of the barrenness of my life as a punishment. I thought that if I lay there for a long time, that the world might go away. Then, eventually, I got up and made my way to the bathroom. The electric lights didn't work, but enough moonlight leaked in from the street for me to find my way with little difficulty. I was walking along the short corridor that led to the bathroom when my eye was caught by the mirror on the wall. Something, not a reflection, had moved in it. I stopped. Once again there was a movement in the depths of the glass. I stepped up to it and put my fingers against it. Staring into the image, I saw what appeared to be a reflection of the corridor I stood in, but instead of my face, I saw that of Christian Lecoq's. Despair began in my heart because the heart knows before the mind has framed the thought. Christian stood in the real world and I stood in my own. I was alone in this house, removed from other beings. I had neglected the warmth of other people in my life and was condemned now to be without them. Perhaps I was dead already, but death would have been a release, and I was still meant to suffer. Christian saw me and began to talk. He was amazed, I could see it in his eyes, and also afraid. There was no room in me for fear or wonder. Despair pulled me down, threatening to collapse me from within like a paper bag. I tried to get his attention. I tried to point to the book I dropped, the book filled with the language of angels, the book of the knowledge of resurrection. I tried to let him know that if I could only turn the next page, I would find the truth that would make sense of all our lives. And then, finally, he understood. He picked up the holy book, though to him I guessed it meant nothing. Even so, he pressed it to the mirror. The words were backwards, but even so, I read them and finally realized what my whole life had been about. Then Christian was gone, and I was alone again. In my head was the liquid mercury of the divine word, the gift of the archangel. I walked into the kitchen. I found the stump of a candle and some matches. I lit the candle, and in its flickering, comfortable yellow light, I ran the taps into the kitchen sink and washed my bloodied neck. From the kitchen drawer, I took a long carving knife. I took it because the angel told me to. When I was clean, I took the candle and walked through into the living room. I sat down in Rosa's chair by the window and looked down onto the street. It was still the same street. The shops were shuttered, but they were still the same shops. There was no breeze. The signs hung silent and motionless from the shop fronts. The moonlight bathed everything in its strange light. Not a living thing stirred. The wound in my neck throbbed with each beat of my heart. I put my fingers to it and pressed it gently to relieve the pain. I waited because I was in his power and could do nothing else. I felt the wind on my cheeks before anything else. It came under the door of the living room. Then the door slowly blew open. The spirit entered the room and made it pregnant. I was filled with dread and foreboding. I began to tremble, and I was seized by a sickness born of terror at this ineluctable thing. In Hebrew, its name is ruach, which means breath. I stood because to sit there and refuse a summons would have been futile. We have no control over these things, though we may like to deceive ourselves. I tell you this, all living things, and you also, my friend, will face this summons. When we think of other people or whole nations facing their deaths, we can be dispassionate. An elderly relative, someone suffering a long sickness, an uncle, a brother, a friend. We are saddened, but these endings are not the brick wall of truth that ends our own life. I became filled up with dread at the thought of my death, and the jailer's spirit summoned me to it. The door was fully opened now. It could not be seen. It is not a person as we are people. It does not live as we do under the shadow of ending, and so is completely unlike us. I walked down the stone stairs. The street door opened in front of me. Outside stood the black carriage with its black horse. The driver said nothing but opened the door with his foot. The horse tossed its head impatiently, jingling the brass of its harness. I stepped up into the carriage. On the seat was the tarot card they call the Star. On it, a naked girl drew water from a pool, while above her in the sky burned 7 stars. I closed the door behind me, and almost immediately the carriage started to move off. The horse pulled me through the streets in an unhurried walk. The furnishings of the carriage were all black silk, and it struck me that this was a funeral car, not for the coffin, but for the relatives. It seemed I would be a guest at my own funeral, perhaps the only guest. But there was time yet for the coffin. I could not tell you through which streets we went. I was wholly preoccupied in my own gnawing fear. My mind was turned inwards, but not to seek the key of knowledge, only to contemplate the paralyzing dread that spread throughout my innards. I gripped the handle of the carriage door, but didn't notice I'd done so until finally the waves of pain pierced the veil of fear, and then, once I released the handle, I was pulled back into myself again. I don't know how long we travelled. I should have made much of those last moments, breathing in the night air, wondering at the beauty of the moon, but I could think of nothing but myself, a dog chasing its own tail. The carriage stopped. The driver didn't speak, but I knew we'd arrived at my journey's end. I stepped down from the carriage. I expected the carriage to move on, but it did not. It just stood there, horse and driver, completely silent. Then I looked out to see where I was. I stood before the gates of the mental hospital to which I had committed my only daughter. There was a large gate, but it opened at my slightest touch. The spirit did not guide me now. I suppose I had to find my own way. I walked through the parkland towards the complex of buildings, up that straight path that I had last walked all those years ago when I had come to find Liesel. The Kirche am Steinhof, that modernist Jugendstil church at the top of the hill above the mental hospital, stood before me. Light burned inside and flowed out through the blue and gold of the stained glass window and the doors. It was the light of 1,000 candles, at least 1,000 candles. I saw them like a field of ethereal marigolds flickering through the open door. I walked slowly towards the church. There was no escape, so I walked on. I mounted the steps and went in under the 4 guardian angels carved of stone above my head. Inside the church the light was blinding, the light of the candles reflected off the shimmering gold ornamentation. Urlicht, the first light. The altar stood in marble and gilt beneath the filament crown shaped like a woman's headdress. Above the altar, awesome with drawn sword, hovered the form of the great archangel Michael. Completely motionless and wordless, he was the end of creation, one pole of the universe. If I could have felt fear, I would have collapsed. But I was damned and dead and insane anyway. He compelled my eyes, and I gazed on this beauty for an aeon, until I was aware of a voice that filled the whole church. It pattered and chanted in a hypnotizing, mesmerizing rhythm, soft and surging, full of supplication. I realized that it was praying. On his knees, bent down by the altar, face away from me, was the dark-clothed shape. I knew who he was, but I did not dare look on him. The Diabolus. Though a man can eventually come to look upon the personal wickedness in himself, he can never bear to gaze upon the face of pure evil. Power, like mounting electricity, but deeper than that, filled the church. The spirit was all around me. I stood in the center of quaternity. The truth is not a trinity, it is 4. 4 is complete. Though we never care to name the 4th, we know who he is. The Dark One stood up and moved to one side of the altar. The angel came down and stood beside him on the other side. The altar stood between 2 pillars. The one on the left was of black marble. This is the pillar of severity. On the right was the white pillar, the pillar of mercy. And between them, between the angel and the Dark One, inlaid on the floor in gold, was an equal-armed cross. As they moved, I saw that standing on the cross was a kid. It bleated nervously and looked around. I felt the weight of the knife in my pocket and knew what I was supposed to do. I took the knife in my hand and stepped forward. The goat bleated again. It wanted its mother and the warmth and comfort of her milk. It was young. It had not experienced life, and even if it ever did, like us, it would never understand why it had been born. But God is hungry for the blood of those he has created. And he knows that without good and evil there is nothing. We can only exist in the tension of opposites. In one move, I stepped forward and picked up the kid. That living thing, warm and alive, born to suffer and die, struggled and kicked against me. I threw down the knife onto the cross. They showed no anger, nor did they make any move to stop me. I took the goat and slowly walked out of the church. It lived, and so did I. But for how long? For how long? 37. Kahlenberg. As they came down the steps of Odeberg's apartment block, they saw that dawn had come. The sun had risen half above the rooftops to the east and hung there huge and red. All around were the sounds of early morning. The birds sang in the trees. Here and there men and women walked along the pavements. They were few at this early hour, but as they passed, nearly all gave a brief, secretive glance at the couple who walked slowly arm in arm. They looked like they'd been up all night. Neither did they have the bored familiarity of a married couple. Besides, which married couple would be walking so romantically along the streets of old Vienna at that hour? Tasmin and Lycos found a working men's cafe that was open and serving breakfast. Tasmin sat down at one of the tables outside on the street while Lycos went in to order. She loosened her coat and took it off, placing it over an unoccupied chair. Then she sat in silence, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin. She closed her eyes like a cat and tilted her face towards its orange disk. Lycos came out of the cafe and studied her quietly until, perhaps feeling his gaze, she turned towards him, smiling. He put down the coffee in front of her, along with a bread roll and a scraping of salted butter on an unpretentious but clean plate. "I'll have to be the waiter, I'm afraid." He grinned and sat down. They took the first sips of their coffee together in silence. "I feel quite light-hearted," she said. Then she looked down, as if ashamed of what she'd said. There was a long pause. A more sombre note had intruded into the symphony of morning sunlight. "We tried to get through to him," he said. "We did try, Tasmin. Do you think he'll be all right? Do you think we'll go to the Café Herrenhof and find him sitting there with his coffee?" "I don't know. Whatever happens, things will never be the same." "What do you think it all means?" "I'm not sure it means anything. It just is. We're all alone in the end." She looked mournful. "You think it's the end, then?" He reached out and took her hand. He squeezed it tightly. "Not now, not for us. It's a beautiful morning. The coffee's good and the bread's fresh." After they'd finished their breakfast, they wandered through the narrow streets of the inner city, past the churches and dull exteriors of palaces. The city went to work around them. They bought some cheese and some bread and a bottle of wine with the idea of having a picnic. The day was hot and dry, the sky an intense summer blue. But where? Lycos turned to some workmen having a break from digging a hole in the road. "Where's good for a picnic?" There were three of them, eating their breakfast and drinking coffee. A dark-haired man with a bushy moustache shook his head and shrugged, but one of the others, slightly older, with a kind but weather-beaten face, said, "You should go to the Vienna woods, climb the Kahlenberg." "Where's that?" asked Lycos. "It's the highest here, lots of trees. You can see it to the north of the city. If you can get a lift to Nussdorf, you can walk from there." He turned back to Tasmin and translated what the man had said. She looked at the workman and said, "Danke schön." He grinned and said, "Chin chin," in English, taking a slurp of his coffee. They walked on. Tasmin slung her jacket over her shoulder. Then she said, "I'm feeling extravagant," and stood by the roadside hailing the cabs that went past. One stopped and they got in. "Nussdorf, please," Tasmin said, and sat down in the back. Lycos got in next to her. When they moved off, he wondered what would have happened if he'd never met Louise. Would he have learned to love Tasmin? She looked up at him. "You're quiet. Please don't pretend you've gone shy." A slight blush came to his face, but he said nothing. The taxi trundled on through the city streets, round the ring, then up the Währingerstrasse and into the northern suburbs. They were soon among the vineyards, and the driver drew their attention to the small shacks called Heurige. He explained they were establishments licensed to sell the wine from their own vineyards. It was a local tradition, especially in the vineyards north and west of Vienna. They drove through the Heiligenstadt, and the taxi dropped them at Nussdorf. He pointed the way for their ascent up the Kahlenberg. The day was warm, and bees and butterflies attended to the brightly coloured flowers of the wayside and in the gardens of cottages they passed. The countryside was one of rolling hills, meadows and woods. The path that led to the top of the Kahlenberg soon left the houses behind, and they were amongst trees and vineyards. The grapes soaked up the sun. A buzzard launched itself from the wooded slopes and then circled on outstretched wings, mewing as it went. Pigeons called contentedly in the shade of the trees. The cows went ahead, every few yards stopping and waiting for Tasman to catch him up. "Any chance of opening that wine yet?" "No, not until we get to the top." A few yards further on, the trees cleared, and they stopped to get their breath and admire Vienna and the Hungarian plains laid out in front of them. The sun glinted on the Danube as the light led the eye east into the distance, towards invisible Budapest, Belgrade, then Romania and the Black Sea. Licose took her arm to help her go on, but she shook it free. "I can do it on my own, thank you." For an instant the old fire, and then it subsided. "I'll push you up the path if you want. You're older than me." "How do you know I'm older than you?" "You're 35. "You've been prying," he said, grinning. "I've only been taking an interest." They walked on a little way and came to the entrance to a cemetery, almost lost in the woods to their right. An old woman sat there on a bench, shading her eyes from the bright sky to look at them. "Es ist sehr warm heute," Tasman said to her in German. "Are you tourists?" the old woman asked. "I suppose so. Visit this cemetery. It has very famous people buried here." Licose shook his head. "I've had enough of cemeteries." The old woman shot him a reprimanding glance, then she looked at Tasman. "There is a very interesting inscription on the grave of the most beautiful woman in Austria, as beautiful as your wife, perhaps." "I'm still not going in," smiled Licose, flirting gently with the old lady. She smiled back. "What are you, English, American?" "Breton." The old woman said, "We're all friends now. But you mustn't neglect your education. You tell us what the inscription says." "It was placed there for her by her lover, who was heartbroken at her young death. It says, 'Ye that ere lost an angel, pity me.'" She shook her head slowly. "Such a sad story." Tasman gave her a lingering look, as if trying to see whether the old woman's words had some deeper meaning. But Licose took her by the arm and said, "We must go now. We're so slow. It'll be dark by the time we get to the top." Tasman didn't shake off his grasp. They waved goodbye and continued walking onwards. Just before the path turned into the trees again, Tasman looked back. The bench was empty. The old woman was gone. Up they went, and eventually they zigzagged their way to the top of the Kahlenberg. They found a cafe with a wonderful terrace and a garden stocked with sweet-smelling flowers. Although they had a picnic with them, the view from the terrace was so stunning that they sat down and had a glass of wine each. The waiter was proud of his local vintage as he poured them a glass each. They sat in the sunshine, almost alone on the terrace looking down on Vienna and the Danube. Tasman said, "I feel that we're at the heart of Europe here." She gazed east to the plains that led to the Carpathians and Poland, and then to Russia and the Urals. Her mind remembered white Greek churches in the clear blue Aegean, the tiled walls and orange trees of Seville, the view of Winchester from the water meadows, the rocks of Connemara. Her words for him conjured up the sea on the rocky coasts of the Morbihan, the icy wastes of Norway, the forests of Karelia, the dry rocks of Malta, the towers of Lisbon looking westwards in the dying sun. But today, the wine was good, the sky was blue, the grapes swelled with the new wine. They sat there for hours until the evening began to cool and the sun went down in the west. Then they went inside the cafe. There was a bar area with wooden tables and vines across the ceiling. Licose lit a cigarette for her as they looked out of the open window. They hadn't noticed him in the gloom, but a young man sat at the piano. He looked quietly at them and without a word began to play. Tasman said softly, "Let's dance." And Licose took her in his arms and they danced slowly in circles in the gathering gloom. The air was warm and filled with the sweet scent of jasmine, dog rose, and honeysuckle. The pianist played a profoundly serene series of single-toned phrases. They intensified the stillness of the night and the garden. He was picking out notes slowly, unhurriedly, in a jazz style. It was music to turn the world by. The open, unhurried notes filled the darkened bar. They danced as the night softly took possession of the room, until all that could be made out were the glowing tips of their cigarettes as they circled. Hör auf zu beben, bereite dich zu leben.